Okay, until our tech help arrives, we'll try to do it this way. We had ended up last time in the early July of 1944 when Admiral Horthy calls off the deportations in Hungary, just as they had completed sending Jews from virtually all the provinces of Hungary, and only some 200,000 Jews in Budapest still remained. And the question then is why was Horthy able to call it off, and why did he choose to at this particular time, having already, in a sense, thrown in his lot with the Nazis in the months earlier to this. And this takes us to the so-called Vrba-Wetzler report. Verba and Wetzler were two Slovak Jews who had been sent to Auschwitz in 1942. One of the few in those transports that were still alive in 1944. And that they were even rarer in the sense that they were two Jews who escaped from Birkenau. If you've seen Claude Lanzmann's 9-hour documentary on the Holocaust, which I presume most of you haven't, he is a major figure in that. He is also interviewed in some of the other Holocaust documentaries because he was a very Before we move on to the next topic, I would just sort of tell my favorite Rudy Verba story. In Canada in the late 1980s, there was a so-called Holocaust denial trial of Ernst Zundel in Toronto, and they had a vicious attorney on their side, a man named Doug Christie, who when witnesses, sort of all elderly survivors were brought into the courtroom, he just trampled all over them in the most aggressive, nastiest kind of way. These are elderly people by now who, any kind of slip in memory, and he would just absolutely stomp on them. Until Verba came in as one of the witnesses. Verba was his underground name, and he kept it after the war. Once he joined the Slovak underground, Verba became his code name. But his original name was Rosenberg, which of course is a very identifiably Jewish name. And he had written an early memoir. And Christie just sort of sneeringly says, oh, Mr. Verba, or Mr. Rosenberg, what should I call you? And Verba looks at him and says, my students and faculty call me Professor Verba or Dr. Verba, but you can call me Sir. And Christie really just he had his knees kneecapped, I should say, in the courtroom on that one. With Verba, he really met his match. This is a guy who was used to intimidating and pummeling his witnesses, but Verba, there was just a heavyweight slugging match. So Verba never backed down in the courtroom, and just it was a wonderful brawl to see someone take Christie on like that. In any case, switching away from Hungary, we will now turn to a very different country, Italy. Italy, like Germany, wasn't unified and become a nation state until the mid-19th century. Italy is basically unified in the 1860s, the same time as Bismarck is fighting his series of wars and manages a unified Germany in 1870. Italy is basically at the same time putting itself together from a number of different small Italian states and creating a unified Italy as we know it more or less today. And also had a constitutional monarchy. There was a king of Italy and also then an elected parliament of Italy. Italy, in a sense, was coming into the modern world at that time. Italy had a very small Jewish community, about 50,000 Jews in Italy, 0.1% of the population. So we're talking about a very small minority. It was a minority that was highly assimilated, generations of Italian speaking, not like Jews in Eastern Europe who spoke Yiddish as opposed to the Polish or Ukrainian of their East European neighbors. So they had mainly worked themselves as an urban group. They were urban middle class for the most part. And while in other countries in Europe, the Jews could be turned into the symbol of people's sort of protest against both the aliens in the midst of a new nation and the symbols of an unwanted kind of modern development, a backlash against urbanization and industrialization. The Jews in Italy never could function that way politically. They could never be exploited in that way politically because Italy has such a different history. Urbanization comes back to Europe in Italy. The great Italian city-states, Venice, Florence, Milan, Rome, whatever, are the glory of Italian history. To turn the cities into the bad guys is not something that works in Italian history. And the urban patrician merchant classes that rule those cities are not a new alien element. They are, once again, the glory of Italian history since the Renaissance. So Italian city-states were at the heart of the Renaissance. Urban merchant families as the sponsors of Italian culture and whatever else were there. So Italian Jews fit exactly into what was the template, one might say, almost of the archetypal best aspects of Italian history. And they couldn't, in the same way as German Jews, be turned into the opposition of what was German. Germany defined itself then, and just as Poland defined itself as Polish and Catholic, not Yiddish and Jewish, Germany could define their new nation as a cultural nation, as the opposite of what Jews seem to be identified with. That didn't work in Italy. So political anti-Semitism in Italy in the late 19th century just didn't go anywhere. It doesn't have the purchase or the effectiveness, the traction that it had elsewhere. Italy was a country that didn't come into World War I in 1914. One of the few countries that, despite being part of treaty alliances, when Austria was allied with Austria-Hungary and Germany, but when Austria-Hungary and Germany attacked Serbia and France, the Italians said, well, this was a defensive alliance. You weren't attacked, you attacked everybody else, so we're not bound. And Italy and Italy, unlike everyone else who kind of got dragged in by a chain reaction of alliances, the Italians sat it out for a year. And then more or less took bids. Who would offer them more if they joined their side? Now, the advantage the Allies had was that Austria-Hungary had far more territory that Italy coveted than France. And therefore the Allies could offer a much bigger package to Italy if they came in on the Allied side than the Axis powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, could offer if they came in on their side. So basically Italy puts itself up for auction. In Italy there were pro-war and anti-war parties, and the man who becomes one of the most ardent spokesmen of what was called intervention, going into the war and making Italy part of this great conflict, was a man named Mussolini. Mussolini's pre-war career had been on the left, had been as a socialist, an editor of the main socialist paper in Italy. In 1914, he has a kind of nationalist conversion, doesn't want to miss the war, thinks of the war as a great masculine opportunity for Italians to prove themselves, becomes an ardent advocate of going into the war, and thus when Italy decides in 1915 to sell itself to the highest bidder and join the Allied side, Mussolini is very much at the forefront of that, supporting, pushing, advocating Italy's volunteering itself to become a belligerent in the war, when any sane person would have said, thank God we're out of it, and let's, for heaven's sake, stay out of it. Italy does not. If the Allies thought Italy was going to boost their chances and would be a great asset, it turned out that that was not the case, and that Italy, in a sense, needs help from the Allies to stay in the war. It isn't that they're bringing help to others. That occasioned Winston Churchill's famous quip later in the late 1930s when he was opposing appeasement and urging Britain to stand up to Germany. And one of his conservative colleagues in the Conservative Party in Britain, who was a pro-appeasement person, said we can't go to war with Germany. Italy would be on the other side. To which Churchill said, that's only fair. We had them last time. But in any case, every calculation Italy seemed to make in all of this did not work, as I say. They came into the war. It was not an opportunity to glorify themselves, but they had to be bailed out with help from the Allies. And then, even worse, at the end of the war, having auctioned themselves out for a high price, was not able to cash in. Because if Italy joined in 1915, the United States joins in 1917, and Woodrow Wilson was far more important to the Allies than Italy. And part of what Wilson is self-determination, independent nation states, no new peace based upon annexations and conquests of other people's territory. And Italy comes to the peace conference, is told they can't get the territories that they were promised when they came in the war in 1915. Mainly the coast of what is now Croatia, and was then going to be the new Yugoslavia, that had been areas where Venice had built cities of the Venetian Empire during the Middle Ages. Italy viewed this as sort of their area of historic medieval heritage, and now most of the populations outside of those cities were now Slavic, and Wilson determined these should go to the Union of South Slavs, Yugoslavia, not to Italy. Italy stomps out of the peace conference, utterly angry and disappointed, and proclaims the stolen victory. Well, Italy hadn't had a victory other than having been bailed out by the Allies, but now proclaims that they have had victory stolen from them, and there is huge bitterness in Italy after the war. They entered the war gratuitously and stupidly. They got nothing out of it, and this is part of the chaos in Italy in the post-war period, the grave political instability. Threats, of course, given the model of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, of a rising socialist communist movements that are anxious to bring revolution to Italy, and a panic on the other side of how, in this period of instability, do we prevent Italy from going too far to the left. And that was the atmosphere, a kind of almost looming Italian civil war, that Mussolini now emerges with his Italian fascist movement, the so-called black shirts, in order to save Italy from the left and to save Italy from unstable democracy, and to establish, which he does in 1922, the first fascist dictatorship in the post-war period in Europe. Now I can sit down. Mussolini's movement grows really between 1919 and 1922, offering a defense against the left and offering authoritarian stability over the instability of a democracy and a very fragmented and polarized and angry society in the post-World War situation. Italy becomes the head of state in the fall of 1922, and gradually from 1922 to 29 carries out an incremental construction of a fascist dictatorship. What Hitler did in about 5 months, Italy will go through in about 7 years, a much slower process as he gradually dismantles the other political parties, builds up a police state, and expands the fascist party to become, in a sense, the only political arena in Italy. All other political activity outside the fascist party basically outlawed and banned by the end of the 1920s, and he clearly has become an authoritarian and dictatorial figure that no one can seriously challenge as long as he has the support of the king and the support of the Italian military. For Mussolini, given that Italy was not a country where anti-Semitism had much political traction, ironically, the first fascist movement in Europe is not an anti-Semitic movement. On the contrary, since almost all Jews in Italy are urban middle class, and this was often seen as a middle class against the looming lower class revolt of peasants and workers, a substantial portion of Italian Jews are members of the fascist party. There are more Jews certainly in the fascist party than any other political grouping in Italy. and that it is not yet sorted out that fascism is inherently going to be anti-Semitic. That will take place in the 1930s. In Italy, that doesn't make sense in contrast to much of the rest of Europe. And so the irony being that the foremost model fascist party, the first fascist party into power, is going to be one that is not anti-Semitic and in fact has many Jewish middle-class members in its ranks. Mussolini himself basically says there is no racial question in Italy. He says Italy is a nation by history, not by race. It is really the inheritor of the Roman Empire. What Italy's historic task is to recreate the empire of the Mediterranean. That Italy's role really, if Hitler is dreaming of Lebensraum in the east, Mussolini is dreaming of a restored Roman Empire that controls the Mediterranean, and that he is imperialistic, he is militaristic, he is expansionist, he is dictatorial, but he isn't anti-Semitic, or even at this point particularly racist, viewing Italy as an historic construct, not as the result of a racial construct or a product of a race struggle out of which Italy Italians are not conceived of then as a single race, but rather as a geographic region with a particular history. In private, Mussolini makes various snide remarks about Jews and basically says they have influence, they're powerful, better leave them alone. If they're not a problem, don't make them one. And so he isn't much interested in that and is basically hands off. He's very suspicious of Zionism, which he sees as a double loyalty. Jews who are Zionists are more loyal to the idea of going to the historic Jewish homeland, not supporting their own country. But Zionism in Italy is very weak. The Italian Jews are highly assimilated, and that is not a major issue in Italy itself. While this is going on in the 20s, ironically, Hitler is much more impressed with Mussolini than Mussolini is with Hitler. When Mussolini comes to power with his so-called March on Rome in 1922, this is what Hitler sees as his future model. And that's why he attempts the beer hall putsch in Munich of 1923. He's trying to emulate Mussolini and then sees that as the way in which he could have gotten into power. When that fails, of course, he has to go back to the drawing board and follow the electoral path and the tactics of legality, which will take him a whole another 10 years to get there. We had seen in Hitler's calculations about why Germany could fight a new war with a new configuration that would allow for a different verdict than the verdict in World War I, why he could refight that war with a better outcome. One is that he wants to pick up Italy on the rebound. Italy had fought on the side of the Allies. It was terribly disappointed because it had its stolen victory. So Italy is a revisionist power. Italy is looking out to expand. And so Hitler very quickly realizes Italy is up for grabs and that in the next war they could be a logical German ally. And thus, at a very early point, ethnic Germans, German-speaking peoples living within Italy are the one ethnic German minority that Hitler renounces, that he will not. This is the Tyrol, the German-speaking Tyrol just south of the Alps, a German-speaking enclave in Italy. And unlike all the German populations in the other parts of Eastern Europe, which Hitler will use, the Volksdeutsch, the ethnic Germans, to justify German intervention, in Italy, Hitler makes the exception. We have no claims on the Tyrol Germans. They're going to have to get used to living in Italy, and he demand no territorial border change. They are not going to be returned to an enlarged Germany. So Hitler is the one engaged in both in Mussolini as a model for seizing power and a fascist model, and Mussolini as a future foreign policy partner, is the one who is pursuing Mussolini and is unrequited love. Mussolini does not return the admiration, is not particularly interested in the Nazis. And in something, if he makes snide remarks about Jews in private, he makes even more snide remarks about Germans. he has under no illusion of, in the German racial hierarchy, Mediterranean peoples are pretty far down in the European scale. That Germans have contempt for Italians as inefficient, lazy, undisciplined, not particularly good soldiers. Certainly in World War I, Italy didn't seem to have gained the respect of the German military as a major military potential. So the Italians sense that, in fact, whatever Hitler may be saying, most Germans hold them in fairly low repute, and that they're pretty low on the German racial scale of racial value. And Mussolini thinks their anti-Semitism is a bit crazy. He thinks this is just, there are various comments he makes about the barbarism of Nazism, the idiocy of Nazi racism, far more snide than the things he says about Jews. In 1933, that does not immediately change. For Mussolini, he is increasingly now torn between two things. On the one hand, Hitler is emulating him and praising him as a great fascist model and identifying Mussolini as the pioneer who has set in motion this political future of all Europe, which Italy and now Germany are part of, and holds up Mussolini then as this, as I say, as this pioneer of the political future. And Hitler stands for political expansion, changing boundaries, and if Mussolini is going to expand into the areas that Italy didn't get in 1919, clearly it would have to be on the side of Germany. So there's one temptation is to join with Germany as a fellow fascist and a fellow expansionist. But on the other side, he also realizes that if it came to that kind of alliance, Italy would be an inferior second-class partner to Germany. Germany would be the dominant country, that he would be the subordinate ally, and that Italy would, in a sense, become a dependency of Germany. So in 33-34, basically Mussolini is hands-off in a great distance. And then when Hitler makes a grab that he doesn't like, in summer 1934, Hitler instigates the Austrian Nazis to carry out an attempted coup d'etat against a Austrian regime under a man named Dollfuss, who had already set up a kind of semi-fascist Austrian dictatorship in alternative to a hardcore Nazi Austrian dictatorship. Mussolini likes Dollfuss, is allied with Dollfuss, is suspicious about letting Hitler expand into Austria because Austria is the borderland between Germany and Italy. And Italy is not yet ready to have Nazi Germany as a neighbor. Austria makes a good fence. So when Hitler threatens to overthrow the Austrian government, and in fact Nazis in Vienna assassinate Dollfuss, attempt to carry out a coup d'etat, the man who stops him are not the British or the French, but Mussolini. Mussolini mobilizes the Italian army, sends divisions to the border, and says we will not tolerate a Nazi takeover in Austria. And the only person in the 1930s in Europe who stopped Hitler in his tracks and made him back down were not the French, not the British, but Mussolini in the summer of 1934. And Hitler has to call off the Nazi coup, and the Nazi party has to go underground in Austria at that point. Dollfuss is murdered, but a successor to Dollfuss comes out of his party. And Mussolini basically is the one who has preserved the first attempt, just halted the first attempt of Hitler to overturn the international order in Europe in the summer of 1934. And Mussolini then joins what was known as the Stresa Front, a loose group of Italy, France, and England to coordinate further against any German attempt to upset the international order and to take out aggression against his neighbors. Having done that, however, Mussolini wants to get paid. Mussolini wants to be rewarded for his civic duty of having stopped the Germans in Europe by being allowed to expand Italy somewhere outside of Europe. Now, in the 19th century, all sorts of European powers, but above all France and Britain, had carved up colonies all around the world and nowhere more than in Africa. Most of Africa had been carved up as British colonies, French colonies. Italy got Libya and Eritrea, two little places. Portugal got Angola and Mozambique. But the vast majority, Germany gets Tanganyika and what is now Namibia. But everything else basically on the map of Africa is controlled by Britain and France. Italy decides it wants to expand, and in particular to settle one old score. When the European powers were carving up Africa in the 19th century between them, Italy tried to go inland from the Red Sea, from the coastal region they had made of a town colony, Eritrea, to the last remaining independent kingdom in Africa, that of Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian army defeated the Italian army and drove them out. The only unsuccessful attempt to take over an African territory by a European power that was defeated militarily was the Battle of Adwa, in which the Ethiopians defeated and drove out the Italians, drove them back to their coastal colony of Eritrea in the 1890s. That, for Mussolini, is a burning national humiliation that must be undone. So he decides, after having earned some reward from the Allies, wants to cash in his chips by invading and finishing the last business of the colonization of Africa and take over the last independent country in Africa, the Kingdom of Ethiopia. What he doesn't understand is, of course, between the 19th and 20th century, the rules of the game have changed. Ethiopia, as an independent monarchy, has joined the League of Nations, which is what Wilson created after World War I as the forerunner of the United Nations. And all members of the United Nations, European and non-European, have promised to defend each other against aggression. This is a mutual defense pact as well as an international organization. And the members of the League of Nations have committed themselves to come to the aid of a fellow member of the League as attacked by some other power. So for the Allies now, the quandary is this. Mussolini wants to invade Ethiopia, revenge the defeat at Adwa, and expand the Italian Empire in Africa as a reward for having stopped Hitler from expanding in Europe. For the French and the English, the dilemma is not that they have great concerns about Africans and freedom. They've obviously have taken away the freedom of most Africans already. So this is not so much a great humanitarian human rights defense of Africans. So they're concerned they could always decolonize their own colonies. But it was an issue of the credibility of the League of Nations. If Mussolini attacks Ethiopia, the League of Nations is having the credibility of coming to the aid of an attacked member will be put to the test. And so the Allies Britain and France are caught in this quandary. If they let Italy do what it wants to do in Ethiopia, basically they are saying the League of Nations as collective security is done. And collective security will be exposed, and any hope that the League of Nations and collective security will be a defense against Germany and Europe, which of course is France's number one concern, will be over. If France does not defend Ethiopia and Africa, who's going to defend France and Europe? So on the one side, they have the issue of you have to defend collective security. On the other side, of course, Italy has been the only country in Europe to stand up to Hitler and stop him in his tracks. So you want to ally with and defend Italy. But Italy wants to attack Ethiopia. So you have to make a choice. You either have to stay with Italy and sacrifice Ethiopia and the League of Nations, or stay with Ethiopia and the League of Nations and sacrifice your alliance with Italy. The great accomplishment of British-Italian diplomacy is they lost the League of Nations and they lost Italy. They got the worst of both worlds. They managed to bungle it so badly that they lost all around. And not only does Ethiopia get conquered, but the League of Nations is destroyed as an instrument of collective security. So that's the bad news of what comes out of this. Mussolini attacks Ethiopia. uses poison gas against all the first European countries to use poison gas is not Germany, it's Mussolini in Italy, and is not against Jews, it's against Africans in Ethiopia in 1935. They conquer Ethiopia and add that to their colonial list. The response of Italy in France is to call for sanctions. We will put sanctions on Italy, but the key thing is all sanctions short of war. I mean, I said if we wanted to go to war, we'd go to war with Italy. We want to put on sanctions, quote, short of war, which means they won't put any sanctions on Italy which would have crippled the Italian war economy to prevent them from conquering Ethiopia. So oil is not embargoed, steel is not embargoed, but other things that don't much count are embargoed, and it is a symbolic set of sanctions, not sanctions that will really stop the fragile Italian economy in its tracks, and thus Italy is angry because they're denounced in the League of Nations. Sanctions are called for, but the sanctions don't stop Italy from conquering Ethiopia. They do stop Mussolini from talking with and working with Italy and France or with the League of Nations. So the disaster foreign policy-wise of 1935 is that Italy detaches itself from France and Britain, is no longer interested in being the policeman of Europe against Hitler on their behalf. The League of Nations, as having any credibility of collective security, is in shambles, and the door is open for both Hitler and Mussolini to go in the opposite direction. What completes the reversal of alliances is next year the Spanish Civil War. In the summer of 1936, Spain has a Popular Front election, just as France did, almost at the same time. In Spain, the result is the same. The left, the Popular Front, the defenders of the Republic, win a narrow victory. But in Spain, what that triggers is an uprising of the Spanish army led by Francisco Franco. And the attempt at a military coup is only half successful. The army manages to seize control in part of Spain, but the Republic manages to keep loyal units and control of the other half of Spain. So Spain is now half Franco, half Republic, and there is a civil war. And the question is, who is going to win that civil war? And the answer is the one that can get the greatest amount of outside help. The Allies said, the French and the British say, we'll be neutral, we won't intervene. On the side of both Mussolini and Hitler, they say, how fast can we help you and how much? And it is German airplanes that will airlift Spanish army units from Morocco to the mainland that are crucial for the success of the coup. The Navy, for the most part, remain loyal to the Republic, so they can't cross by water. They have to cross by air, and it is the German Air Force that basically ferries the crucial units to Spain for the coup to get a foothold, and the German Air Force thereafter that provides air superiority for the Franco side throughout the war. Mussolini goes even more than that. He sends infantry divisions. He sends land forces to Spain, to work on the side of the Franco army in defeating and overthrowing the isolated republic that gets no help from anybody except Joseph Stalin in Russia, which is a long way off and much more limited in what it can provide. And the result is, over a grinding 3 years, Franco expands and finally conquers all of Spain, and the Spanish Republic falls. What's important for our story, of course, if the Ethiopian crisis drove Mussolini away from the French and the British, the Spanish Civil War brings Hitler and Mussolini together in a joint venture and cements the Italian-German alliance. And by 1939, Mussolini and Hitler have signed the so-called Pact of Steel, a tight alliance between these two countries. That reorientation of Italy is going to have repercussions in Italy for Italian Jews and Italian racial policy. Mussolini earlier, as I said, there is no racial question in Italy. There is no anti-Semitic question. this doesn't exist. In 1938, Mussolini invents an Italian or Jewish problem in Italy as part of his reorientation towards Nazi Germany. In 1938, he issues the so-called Manifesto of Race, in which he now declares race, not history, does shape peoples. Italy is a race, and they're in part of a racial struggle allied with the Germans. And he buys into the whole racial ideology of Hitler, including its anti-Semitism. And Italy, by Mussolini, issues its first anti-Jewish laws. So in Italy after 1938, Jews are to be banned from higher education, banned from the professions, banned from various activities, and so forth in Italy, limited in what their role can be in corporate world, limited in their role in property ownership. The difference, however, is that in Italy this doesn't have nearly the impact that the slow legislative strangulation of German Jewry had. In Italy, it's going to be much more hit or miss. Because in Italy, there are two key exemptions. If you were an early member of the fascist party, or if you were in the Italian army and fought as a veteran of World War I, you're exempted from the anti-Jewish legislation of 1938. In addition, not only you are exempt, but your children and your grandchildren are exempt, and your parents and your grandparents are exempt. So one exemption creates a 5-generation expanded family that is exempt from the laws. So the laws are on the books, but there's large numbers of people that will not be included in it. So the Italians enforce these laws much more laxly than the rigorous German bureaucracy. So the whole issue of the anti-Semitic laws, certainly it ends equality before the law for Italian Jews, but it does not have anything like the impact of isolating them, impoverishing them, turning them into a pariah group that loses all contact with their Italian neighbors that the progressive German anti-Semitic legislation had. Why does Mussolini do this, and what was any background for it? I think there's three things we have to look at. First of all, even before Mussolini introduces anti-Semitic legislation in 1938, he has already introduced racial legislation, racial laws in Ethiopia in 1935. When Ethiopia is going to be colonized by the Italians, he introduces all sorts of legislation to make sure that Italians do not mingle with Ethiopians. That this is going to be a segregationist, apartheid colonial regime. And so all sorts of limits on and discriminations against the native conquered population are put in place, which are the model racial legislation that he can borrow from. And in place of Africans, you can put Jews when it's applied in Italy. So the model for racial legislation is begun in Ethiopia and then imported back to the homeland and applied against Jews in 1938. So it's not the first racial legislation of the regime. It is the second set of discriminatory legislation. A second reason behind it, of course, is that Mussolini is signaling Hitler. Italy is an equal partner to Germany. In Germany's worldview, you're fighting a racial struggle. Italy has to redefine itself in racial terms. You're saying to the Germans, take us seriously, that we are ideological partners, and that we are buying into the German ideological view of the world on racial terms. So it's a love note to Hitler. It's been a kind of an unrequited love. Hitler trying to approach Mussolini in the 20s up into the early 30s. Now Mussolini saying the signals in the opposite direction. Yes, we can date. Yes, we can get married because we are going to buy into and accept your racial approach to things. A third factor was one of domestic politics in Italy, and that is by the late 1930s, Italian fascism is getting old. You have a new generation of young fascists coming in. The middle-class fascists of the first generation are getting older, lazier, less vigorous, less militant, and all too comfortable. And this new generation of Italian fascists begins to talk about how you have to make Italians harder, make Italians more manly, make Italians tougher and more German. And so there's a doctrine of this new generation of creating the new man in Italy. And the symbol for the decadent Italian, the middle-class materialist Italian who has to purge himself of material comforts and a lack of total commitment to the regime, become then the Italian Jews. Here, the symbol of the Italian Jew as the prosperous middle-class urban group can in fact now become the symbol of decadent, materialistic, insufficiently fascist Italians. And so the new generation preaching this new doctrine finds that Italian Jews can be used in this way. And so there is a domestic impetus behind the racial anti-Semitic laws as well. We will harden Italians. We will make them more German. We will make them less materialistic, less concerned with creature comforts and status, more committed to the future if we purge Italy of this comfy bourgeois middle class ethos that Italians are too much characterized by. So Italy does make the leap then into the camp of the Nazis and into the camp of anti-Semitism in the late 1930s. For Mussolini, there's still a problem, and that is Italy is pretending to be a great power, but in reality, in terms of its economic capacities, in terms of its military, it is a second-rate power. And therefore, as much as he may dream about expansion, he does not have the means to do it, and he knows going to war, certainly going to any kind of long war, would be a disaster for Italy. So in 1938, when Hitler is threatening to go to the brink over Munich, Mussolini is thrilled to be the mediator who comes to Munich and proposes the partition of Czechoslovakia, the peaceful Munich agreement to keep Europe out of war. When Hitler threatens to go to war over Poland in 1939, Mussolini wants to do the same thing again. And Hitler says, no way, no one's bilking me in my war this time. And then Mussolini in turn says, well, I'm not joining. So despite the Pact of Steel, Mussolini does not declare war in September of 1939. Britain and France go to war with Germany, and of course they've declared war on Poland. The Soviet Union joins in against Poland. Everybody in Europe is going to war, but not Italy. Mussolini is smartly sitting it out. The great interventionist of 1914 becomes the non-interventionist of 1939. However, in May of 40, when it looks up, much to his surprise, that Germany is going to overrun France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and it's presumed that Britain will then see the light and quit, the question is not will Italy get caught into a prolonged war, will this war suddenly and unexpectedly be over so quickly that he can't get into it in time to sit at the peace treaty table and get part of his expansionist agenda fulfilled. Italy, here's the great irony. Italy had joined the war for territory in World War I, been bilked of it. It stays out of World War II, and now suddenly finds, whoops, I better get in really quick if I want to get spoils from the table before the peace treaty is there, and I haven't been a part of it. So in late May, just as the Allied troops are being trapped at Dunkirk and France is falling, Mussolini declares war on France and Great Britain. And its armies attack on the Italian-Swiss Alps, don't go anywhere. It makes no contribution to the war, but nonetheless they have joined the war, thinking they have cleverly joined just in time to watch the defeat and the end of the war and get to the peace table. France is defeated, but Britain is not, and Italy finds itself in a naval war in the Mediterranean, and finds itself in a colonial war in North Africa, because the British army in Egypt invades the Italian colony of Libya and is quickly taking control and threatening to conquer and drive the Italians out. And then the prospect is, of course, they would lose Eritrea and Ethiopia after that. he will lose his whole African empire very quickly because Britain has total control of the Suez Canal and much of the Mediterranean, and he's no match for that. In frustration, Mussolini finally decides that he is going to teach Hitler a lesson. Every time he says, I pick up the newspaper, Hitler's invaded a new country, and I learn about it afterwards. This time he says, Hitler can pick up the newspaper and see that I've invaded someone. And he decides in the fall of 1940 to attack Greece. Thinking Greece is an easy pickings, this is part of one of the provinces, of course, of the Roman Empire. He will pick up Greece and gain his spoils there. He attacks Greece, and the Italian army is defeated and driven back. Now, Hitler not only reads about the attack on Greece, but reads about the fact that, one, Italy hasn't pulled it off, hasn't conquered them, and Britain is threatening to come to the aid of Greece. If Britain comes to Greece and sets up air bases, what is in range of British bombers are the Ploesti oil fields on which the whole invasion of the Soviet Union is dependent. Suddenly, Mussolini's blunder in Greece threatens to derail Hitler's whole plans, and he quickly has to go to the drawing board and improvise an invasion of Greece so he can neutralize that. The country that he thought would ally with him that doesn't is Yugoslavia. So then he has to devise an invasion because you can't get to Greece without getting through Yugoslavia. And in April of 1941, he attacks Yugoslavia and Greece and conquers both of them very quickly. And he also sends a detachment of troops to Libya to bail out the Italians who are about to lose there. That is an obscure divisional commander named Erwin Rommel, who will eventually gain fame as the, quote, Desert Fox, initially sent to North Africa simply to bail the Italians out with a minimum investment of a couple of divisions of German troops to prevent losing their foothold on the south side of the Mediterranean. So basically in the spring of 1941, Hitler engages in a let's save Mussolini in spite of himself, let's bail out the Italians in Greece and in Libya, and he does indeed pull that off. Rommel immediately drives the British back into Egypt, and the German armies immediately conquered Yugoslavia and Greece. Hitler wants to move all of his troops, of course, to the Soviet Union for the looming invasion a month later. So having done all of this, Hitler's next decision is, even if the Italians can't conquer these territories, at least they ought to be able to occupy the territories that have already been conquered. So let's save German troops by giving Italy big slices of occupation zones in the countries that we now control, and spare German troops. The Italian army can certainly just sit on countries that have already been beaten and free up German troops for the invasion of the Soviet Union. So if we can look at the map, Italy is going to get three key occupation zones. This is Greece here. Germany will keep a sliver of Greece in the north with the main city of Thessaloniki, but the bulk of Greece here is going to be an Italian occupation zone. Yugoslavia is going to be divided up, and to keep the rail lines to Thessaloniki, Germany will keep Serbia for itself, but Croatia, which is made up then of basically of Montenegro and Bosnia and Croatia, but are now three different states, which the Germans install, is going to have an Italian occupation zone, and the Germans are just going to occupy this region here. So this whole Croatian state is going to be divided between an Italian zone and a German zone. Northern Yugoslavia, Slovenia, becomes Third Reich. It's like the incorporated territories in Poland. It's brought into Germany in its entirety. Italy is also given an occupation zone in France. In the fall of 1942, when the Allies, a story that comes somewhat later, when the unoccupied zone is occupied by the Germany, they basically give a zone here to the Italians to take care of as well. So there's significant areas in this region now where there's no German troops. They've been conquered by Germany, but they are left to the Italians to be the policemen, to be the occupiers. And that is going to introduce a very strange story in that Italy becomes the only country in Europe that not only defends its own Jews from the final solution in the end, but is going to defend foreign Jews in the territories they occupy elsewhere. Now, we've seen Romania save the Jews of the old kingdom, Romanian Jews, but they murdered Bukovinan, Bessarabian, and Ukrainian Jews. We've seen that in Hungary, that basically they tried to protect Hungarian Jews, but they slaughtered Serbs and expelled foreign Jews into the Ukraine to be killed in the summer of 1941. It wasn't untypical that countries had a double standard, that they wanted to preserve their own Jews, but they gladly sacrificed foreign Jews to Hitler in order to gain the territories that came there. Italy is the only one that, in its occupation zones, protects its Jews from the Germans. So one of the great ironies of World War II, that if you were trying to escape Hitler and the final solution, the places you could flee to were either Franco-Spain, which had been put into power by Hitler, or the Italian occupation zones, or Italy, Hitler's allies. They're better able to defend their Jews than the countries that Hitler has conquered. How that takes place is sort of what I want to get to now. Once the war gets going, as we've seen, Italy did not have great success. They're bailed out by the Germans, are given certain occupation zones, but are generally treated increasingly with contempt by the Germans as a country that's not pulling its weight and increasing its dependency on Germany. From 1940 to 42, increasingly Italians become aware of the fact that they have caught themselves in an absolutely no-win situation. If Germany loses this war, Italy is going to be dragged down with it. If Germany wins this war, Italy is going to become a second-rate satellite that basically will not really be a country that is fully sovereign. It will be a dependency on Germany, and Germany will be able to dictate its foreign policy, its goals, and whatever. That this is a lose-lose war, and that with that there is increasing disaffection, and increasing a lack of interest in dying for Italy, when dying for Italy means dying for Germany. That why are we in this war to help Germany when even if Germany wins, that's a disaster for us. So keeping up the spirits of an Italian war effort is very difficult. The Mussolini regime becomes increasingly one of widespread disaffection, of people losing their fascist enthusiasm, and above all, the bureaucracy and the army beginning to think about alternatives as well. So that's sort of the situation in 1942, when in the occupation zones, Germany now begins its policy, of course, of genocide and the attack upon the Jews that are outside of Germany but in the German sphere. And they come to the Italians in both concerning the Jews of the Greek zone, the Jews of the Croatian zone, the Jews in the French zone, and in succession make a series of demands in which they, to their surprise, find the Italians are increasingly uncooperative and unwilling to play ball. It begins in Greece. They're thinking of deporting the great Jewish Greek communities in Thessaloniki, which is under German control, and there are scattered Jewish communities in the rest of Greece. And the Germans begin to implement anti-Semitic rules against the Jews in the city of Thessaloniki, and want the Italians to do the same thing in their zone. We should have one uniform policy for all of Greece, in preparation, of course, for deporting all the Jews of Greece. And when they go to the Italians in Athens, when the military missions meet, the Italians in Athens say, oh, well, we couldn't possibly make this decision ourselves. We'll have to consult Rome. And then nothing happens, and weeks later, the Germans come back and said, well, have you heard anything from Rome? Well, yeah, but it was a garbled code and we couldn't translate it. So we've asked them again. And then they come back again and say, well, have you heard anything? Well, it looks like you have to discuss this in Rome, not here. And so then the Germans go to Rome and they try to open the question and says, well,
Well, no, that's a local question. You have to talk to the people in Italy, or in Athens. And the Germans are in this chasing their tail in Greece, in which they never get an answer from anybody, because the Italians just keep sending them on to another desk. Now, if you've ever dealt with Italian bureaucracy, you know this is standard. They didn't have to learn this from scratch. I mean, this is what happens when you deal with Italian bureaucracy. But they applied it to the Germans, and that was new for the Germans. And so they found themselves getting the runaround, quite literally, until they finally throw up their hands and say, we'll just go ahead into Thessaloniki. They carry out the great deportation of Greek Jews from Thessaloniki in the spring of 1943. They never get the Jews in southern Italy. By the time Italy goes out of the war, the Jews there know, in fact, how to hide. The Athens Jewish Committee burns all of its records, unlike, say, in France, where the police have records of all French Jews. There are no records of who's a Jew in southern Greece. And they all look dark-skinned Mediterranean. I mean, who's a Jew? You can't tell a Greek from a Jew. And in fact, that except for the Jews on the islands, where they are trapped and can't hide, the Germans never get their hands on many Jews in southern Italy. They do get them on Rhodes and elsewhere, but not in most of, or in Corfu, but they can't get them in the areas where they can flee to the countryside and hide. So Greece, basically, the Germans come up empty-handed. In France, they come and they try to get I should say, when the Germans come in to occupy their part of France, and Italy has its zone, Jews flee from the German zone into the Italian zone, and is quickly seen as a place of refuge. When the Vichy police try to carry up roundups of Jews in the Italian zone, you get these wonderful reports, the frustrating back to these unbelieving Germans. Well, the French were reporting that we tried to round up Jews in Grenoble, and the Italian army at gunpoint disarmed us and sent us away. I mean, the Italians are just saying, you don't do anything in our zone unless we say you can. You don't come here and carry up roundups without our permission. And the Italian zone in France becomes a zone of refuge, safe haven to which Jews are going to flee as well. Most complex is the situation in Croatia. Now, Yugoslavia had been put together by a combination of a number of separate South Slav groups: Serbians, Slovenians, Croatians, Macedonians, Bosnians, and this had its tensions in the interwar period. Particularly resentment of Croatians against the Serbs as kind of the dominant group. The capital, Belgrade, is in Serbia, not in Zagreb in Croatia. And so the Germans had chances to sort of play divide and conquer. And when they come into Yugoslavia, they basically dismember the country. And these different Slavic groups there have different fates. Macedonia is given to Bulgaria, which has always claimed it. Slovenia is given to Germany. Which is Slovenia is kind of like a Slavic Austria. It is, you barely know you've crossed the border when you go from Austria to Slovenia, but it has a different language, but it's geographically and whatever, it's very much that kind of area. The two core areas, Serbia and Croatia, Germans set up their occupation administration in Serbia. They find a puppet government for Croatia. Now, they went to the major parties. None of them agreed to serve the Germans. They turned then and looked for a puppet that would serve them, and they had a radical fascist movement in Croatia, the Ustasha, headed by a man named Pavelic. Has very little popularity. He can't take power on his own. So the Germans are stuck in setting up a regime that can only be propped up if there are German troops there to keep it there. And so the Croatian fascist regime is created in Croatia. Half of it's going to be in a German zone, and they give the coastal region, half of it, to the Italians. Croatians immediately begin to settle their own scores. They begin to chase down their own Jews. But even more important for Croatia is to settle scores with the Serbs within the new Croatian boundaries. There are large minorities of Serbs in Croatia, and the answer of the Croatian government is that we should kill a third, expel a third, and convert a third from Greek Orthodox of Serbia to Catholic Croatian, assimilate a third. So massacres in Croatia carried out by these horrific Ustasha firing squads are widespread. The most numerous victims are Serbs, and there's huge waves of Serb refugees fleeing over the border into Serbia. But in many of the areas where there's Serb minorities, they set up their own self-defense units. And these self-defense units are called the Chetniks. These are the Serb nationalist movement. And there's a civil war in all of Yugoslavia, but most particularly in Croatia. And in the Italian zone, if the Germans want the Italians to govern half of Croatia to save them manpower, the Italians want to find indigenous auxiliaries to basically save them manpower, and they ally with the Chetniks. So you have the German-sponsored Ustasha militants on the German zone, the Italian-sponsored Serb nationalists in the Croatian and in the Italian zone, and they're fighting each other. But this also is going to create a situation where the Italians increasingly are going to make sure the Ustasha units cannot come into the Italian zone. That's going to be crucial because that's going to protect Italian Jews as well. Croatian Jews as well. That as basically a de facto line gets drawn through Croatia, and the Ustasha is limited what it can do in the Italian zone, Jews from the other parts flee there and are going to find a kind of de facto protection as well. And so while the Ustasha is carrying out mass murders of Serbs and Jews in part of the country becomes a protected area. Now, in Yugoslavia, you also have other groups as well. We haven't talked about Tito and the partisans and the communists and whatever. But there's a kind of 3 or 4 and often 5-sided civil war going on. I remember reading one document about a German unit comes into a town, and immediately they're besieged by Ustasha representatives, Chetnik representatives, communists, all coming and saying, we're on your side. The other guys are all the bad guys. Help us wipe them out. And the German soldier's head is just spinning. He can't make head or tails of a multi-sided civil war in which everybody wants to use the Germans for their own purposes. But it is a complexity we don't have to get into other than the fact that the Italian zone of Croatia becomes a sanctuary for Jews, and they flee there. After the Ustasha has killed the Jews they can lay their hands on, they then go to the Germans and say, pressure the Italians to turn over the Jews, and we can take care of them. Or if you don't do that, at least pressure the Italians to turn over the Jews to you to be deported to Auschwitz. If we're going to have a pure Croatian state, we got to get rid of the Serbs, we got to get rid of the Gypsies, we got to get rid of the Jews. And the Italians say, no, we won't turn them over to the Ustasha. But for the German request, they sort of say, well, no, we can't do that. And then the Germans say, well, at least you have to concentrate them. At least you have to bring them together, detain them. You kind of have to ghettoize them. That, of course, is always the first step for when you're targeting a group to take away. And the Italians kind of say, okay. And then, there's not many times when you study the Holocaust, you read a document and you break out loud laughing in an archive. But the most pleasurable document I had reading in this whole dismal topic was a correspondence between the Italians and the Germans over the German demand that the Italians, first have to concentrate their Jews, and then they were supposed to turn them over later. But in the correspondence, at one point, the Germans come to the Italians and say, we need the beach resort hotels on the Adriatic coast for rest and recreation for German troops who are wounded and need recovery. And the Italian answer is, well, you told us to concentrate the Jews, and so we put them up in the resort hotel so you can't have them. And then you get German, you can't have the beach resorts, that's where we've stuck the Jews, because you said we had to concentrate them. Where else? We have empty hotels, there's no tourists now, so we put them up there, and they're not available for the German army. And so the Germans never get their hands on the Italian Jews. Now, the decision to protect these Jews was not made by Mussolini at the top. These are decisions made by Italian military commanders, Italian occupation authorities that have become increasingly disaffected and increasingly aware that German victory means Italian defeat, and any way not to get dragged down with the Germans, any way to stick their thumb in a German eye and twist it is one they're going to grab. So when we come to, in a sense, trying to kind of explain why Italy, up until the fall of Mussolini in the fall of 1943, saves French Jews in France, Croatian Jews in Croatia, Greek Jews in Greece, not just Italian Jews, I think has a number of factors to it that we have to look at. The initial answer was, well, Italians are just humane and the Germans are inhumane, the kind of the national character answer. Well, if you look at what Italians did in Libya and Ethiopia, they are not humane. When Italians are building their own empire, they can be just as vicious as any other colonial conqueror. What they weren't willing to do is to be vicious on behalf of the Germans. They'll be vicious in their own cause. If one goes to the coast of Croatia now, there are memorials to Italian concentration camps on the coast. They didn't create concentration camps for Jews. They created them for Slovenes in the section of Slovenia Italy is annexing, where they had lots of resistance, and they arrest Slovenians, take them down, and put them into these camps, one of which had a death rate equal to Mauthausen. These were horrific camps. Over 50% of the prisoners on the island of Rab that were Slovenian died under Italian custody. So we're not talking about a universal humanitarianism here. These people could be as vicious as you can imagine when they're talking about building an Italian empire. But they won't be as vicious to build a German empire. And so they will protect Jews where they won't protect other groups that are there on their own agenda. Part of what allows them to get away with it is that while Germans had very little respect for Italians, Hitler does have respect for Mussolini. And Mussolini has a whole lot more freedom to say, elbow room, than, say, a Horthy or an Antonescu. And basically the Germans are instructed by Hitler, you don't push him around. You give your respect to the pioneer, the inventor of fascism. You don't bully him. So that Mussolini, even though he wasn't the origins of protecting these Jews, he is inadvertently, in spite of himself, in a sense, kind of the shielding umbrella that allows other Italians to carry out rescue efforts that he himself had no concern about. He doesn't give a rip about this, but he allows the stuff to go underneath him. One of Mussolini's most famous quotes was, he says, "I'm the most disobeyed dictator in history." Unlike Hitler, he has trouble getting Italians to do things. And indeed, Italians did things that he didn't approve, but that they could get away with because Italy didn't simply have the kind of disciplined, total control state that the Germans did. So Italy in all of this, up until 1943, is able, in fact, to protect Jews in a unique way in Europe. When Mussolini is overthrown and Italy switches sides in September of 43, by that time, of course, Germany's options are much more limited, and everybody knows much more. Immediately, Jews flee the areas where the Germans are going to fill in for the defeated Italians, find other places to hide. The Germans occupying northern Italy, occupying Croatia, occupying southern Greece, do not make anything like the haul that they would have made if they had taken these territories in the beginning and never parceled them out as occupation zones to Italy. Everybody by then knows what you have to do. It runs to the hills, manages to escape, and as I say, Germany gets very little gain in terms of taking those territories over after September of 1943. So the issue of international rescue we will come to next week. The second kind of rescue is national rescue. We've looked at the example of Italy already. We'll look very briefly at Denmark in a minute. But these are cases in which rescue takes place within the framework of a particular nation and its national policies. There is rescue by organizations which are created and committed to rescue. We've talked a bit about Zagoda, the Catholic rescue organization in Poland, which was crucial for providing hiding places, false papers, and this kind of thing to aid in the hiding of Jews in Poland. And there is what I would call communal rescue, pockets in Europe of towns, villages, or groups of villages where the ethos of the area was very hospitable to rescue, where Jews could go and find safe haven among a local population that was willing to hide them, willing to cover them, and not just either chase them away or turn them in. And so villages of rescue is a key one when you look at. The most famous of these is the village of Le Chambon, which we will look at today. And then there is individual rescue, people who hide Jews on an individual basis. Most famously in Poland, we've seen the example of Thomas Bloch, where you go and you knock on the door of a farm and say, please hide me. Or on the knock of the door, please give me a meal. And what do individuals do when faced with that instant snap decision they have to make? And what kinds of individuals engage in rescue? So today I want to look at the last two of these, communal rescue on the one hand, individual rescue on the other, and we'll be looking and also at Denmark very briefly, and then we'll look at international rescue and the role of the churches and the United States, the Allies, Great Britain, next week. So let's turn first to the issue of Denmark as kind of a parallel to Italy. Denmark, like Italy, had the advantage that it had a very small population, had been very ungenerous towards refugees in the 1930s, so it had no large number of foreign Jews in the country. Basically, it had about 7,000 Jews, and they were virtually all assimilated Danish Jews. So the numbers are very small. It's always easier to rescue a very small number of people than 3.5 million Polish Jews. It's a wholly different magnitude that we're talking about. Denmark also had the advantage is that it was, of all the areas of Hitler-conquered Europe, it was, that are occupied by German forces, the one that had the greatest degree of independence. When Hitler is on his way to invade Norway, where he wanted to have the coastline for submarine bases, he wanted to secure the coastline for the importation of iron ore from northern Sweden to Narvik and down the coast, which couldn't be intercepted by the British Navy. He had to invade Norway in April of 1940. To get to Norway, he had to go through Denmark. And the Danes, knowing that they had already lost a war to Prussia in 1861, were not going to defeat the Third Reich in 1940. And the Danes immediately said, we surrender. And the terms of the surrender were that the Danish government remains in place, the Danish constitution remains in place, the Danish political parties that run the parliament remain in place, and that Germany can have a small occupation force there. And what the Danes have to agree to is two things. That they will basically embed the Danish economy into the German war economy, export valuable Danish agricultural products to help feed Germany. Danish dairy products, of course, are very famous. So the cheese of the German army will in part come from Denmark. And that they will limit Danish foreign policy to operate under the guidance of Germany, that there will be no independent Danish foreign policy, that they will simply be in line with what the Germans are doing. So that they don't have to, they're not conquered, but they can't follow an independent foreign policy. For the Danes, what was absolutely crucial was that we will not resist what the Germans did as long as they respect the terms of that peace settlement. And for them, what becomes very quickly the canary in the mine shaft, what will be the sign that the Germans are no longer respecting our limited sovereignty, no longer allowing us to govern ourselves by our own laws, is if they try to do something against Danish Jews. For Denmark, the Danish Jews are Danes. They are part of the Danish society, and they are now seen as the tripwire. They are seen as the canary in the mine shaft, that the proof that Denmark is still a semi-independent, semi-sovereign country, and that Germany will not interfere in the internal affairs of Denmark, is that nothing is done to Danish Jews. There is no anti-Semitic legislation, there is no prejudice against them, and above all, of course, there is no attempt to seize them and to deport them. So for Danish Jews, they take on a certain status as not only being viewed as fellow Danes as opposed to Jews who have a different fate from the local population. They have and are identified as having the same fate. What's crucial to Danes is what happens to their Jews. They are going to be seen as the litmus test, the canary in the mine shaft, the tripwire in terms of Danish-German relations. So for 2 years, the Jews of Denmark live a kind of charmed existence. Nothing can be done to them. The Germans realize this. The Germans respect this, and they keep hands off. And even at the Wannsee Conference, the Undersecretary of State of the Foreign Office warns Heydrich, when he's enlisting the help of all of these ministries to carry out the final solution. The Undersecretary of State tells Heydrich, well, I don't think there's any problem in almost any part of Europe except Scandinavia. Don't push this agenda in Denmark because that would be a problem. That would have complications. And so basically the Foreign Office even lines itself up as a kind of distant defender of the Jews of Denmark. In this situation, by 1943, of course, things are beginning to change in that it is clear that Germany is beginning to lose war. After Stalingrad, and above all, in the summer of 1943, when the Germans launch their last attempt at an offensive on the Eastern Front, trying to regain the initiative, they are stopped in their tracks at the great tank battle of Kursk, and at that point and thereafter, Germany experiences nothing but a grinding defeat and retreat from Soviet territory. And of course, the Allies land in North Africa in the fall of 42. They land in Sicily and Italy in 43. They're going to land in Normandy in 44. So for the Danes who can look at the maps and see things, the trend line has changed. German victory is now not only not inevitable, it is looking less and less likely with every passing month. And the result is that some in Denmark begin to say we really ought to resist, we ought to get in on the right side. And the result is the Germans begin to find less cooperation and increasingly, say, in the shipyards of Copenhagen, where Germans are trying to build ships for themselves, increasing sabotage and finally a strike. And when the Danish workers go on strike, this is viewed as breaking the peace from the Danish side. The Germans declare martial law, depose the government that has up until then been allowed to rule, and impose their own government in the place of the Danish government that until then had been left alone to rule. They send to Denmark a man named Werner Best. Werner Best was a crony of Heydrich's, one of the men who created the police state in Germany. And he now is sent as kind of the plenipotentiary, the commissar to Denmark to rule on behalf of the Third Reich. The Foreign Office is no longer seen as adequate to represent Germany there. You're not going to relate to Denmark through an ambassador any longer. You're going to have a plenipotentiary imposed who is going to take over for the now deposed Danish government. Werner Best becomes a very interesting person because on the one hand, he seems to play a double game in the summer and fall of 1943. On the one hand, he goes to Berlin and trying to suck up to Heydrich and to the SS and Himmler and Hitler because he would love even a bigger assignment than Denmark. That's not the biggest trophy on the pile in terms of being a colonial governor for Germany. Says now the time has come that we can take the Danish Jews. Do I have permission to move against them? Will we attempt a deportation from this country? And this is now the fall of 43, after we've carried it out in most other countries. Do we upset the apple cart and make this attempt? And after some dispute in Germany, the Foreign Office says, let sleeping dogs lie. Why would you mess things up? And the SS says, just let's go for them. And Hitler opts for the yes, now we will go after this minuscule community of 7,000 Danish Jews who have been living scot-free in Hitler's Europe up until now. Having done that, Werner Best goes back to Denmark and warns the Danes. He spills the beans to someone who then goes to the Danish side and says, whatever happens, hide your Jews, give them fair warning, get them out of the country if you can, because they are slated for deportation. So the great advantage Denmark has in all of this is that there's a very narrow water passageway between Denmark and Sweden. Up until the spring of 1943, Sweden has been neutral, but in terms of its economics, clearly pro-German. The iron ore mines of Sweden are an absolutely essential component of Hitler's war economy. The Swedes were selling stuff to the Germans and selling it at a seller's price. They were the ones who could drive the bargain. And they basically wanted to stay out of the war and make money. By the spring of 43, they realized that they had better reorient themselves. And one of the ways they begin to reorient themselves as a neutral, not changing sides because they haven't been on one side, but reorient themselves in terms of the spectrum of a pro-German neutrality to an increasingly anti-German neutrality that would make them have an in with the victorious Allies at the end of the war, is to declare in the spring of 43 that any Jews that reach Swedish territory will be accepted, that they will open themselves as a haven for Jews that can escape from Europe, and that means Norwegian Jews will flee into Sweden when they attempt to round up Norwegian Jews, and that any Danish Jews that can get across the very small waterway would be welcomed there as well. Now, of course, there's very small numbers of Norwegian and Danish Jews. The Swedes are not exactly opening the doors in the way the Swiss, when they open their doors, are going to get masses of more refugees than Sweden would. So this is not some great sacrifice on the part of Sweden, but it is an important calculated move to become suddenly humanitarian after years being an integral part of the German war economy. So when the Danes get word that the Germans are going to try to seize the Danish Jews, they first of all tell the Danish Jews, go into hiding. And those who are elderly and whatever that really can't do that, they say, whatever you do, don't open the door when someone knocks on it. And in fact, the deal that in a sense is made is Germans will go call on Jewish residences to round them up, but they won't break in. And this may sound very peculiar, but the Germans promise not to break into Danish homes because they're still trying to have a certain relationship with the Danes. And so if a Danish Jew does not open his door when the Germans come, they're supposed to be safe. Almost all Danish Jews go into hiding. And then in late October, when the roundups begin, they are smuggled across the strait in fishing boats in a rescue operation to Sweden, which agrees to accept them. And about 6,500 Jews are sent to Sweden. The Germans capture about 500 to 700 Jews, I think the figure is, in the end. They do not send them to Auschwitz-Birkenau. They send them to Theresienstadt, which was the showcase ghetto where they are placed, and most of them will in fact survive the war and be released early from Theresienstadt in the spring of 1945 to the International Red Cross and returned to Denmark. So Denmark will save its Jews, and this was often seen as kind of the archetypal rescue operation. It is one, of course, in which many things made it possible. A very small number of Jews, a very high degree of Danish independence, a very late date at which they finally made the move to take Jews, fall of 1944. A neighbor that is not only close, but is already announced it will take whatever Jews can get there, and that all brought together made it possible to save almost all Danish Jews in this rescue operation of 1943. Let's turn to another sort of category, what I call communal rescue. And here the most famous town, the one that's big, Denmark has become the archetypal symbol of national rescue. Chambon-sur-Lignon. has become the archetypal symbol of communal rescue, a village that devoted itself to the issue of rescue and became very known when, in the 1970s, an American scholar, Philip Hollier, published a book about the pastor that was the head of the church in Le Chambon and the way in which the whole village hid Jews in World War II, a book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. It's one I've often used in class. We didn't use it this year, but in any case, as I say, like Denmark, Le Chambon has become, in a sense, the most well-known rescue village in Europe. And here we get to some categories I think it might be useful to look at. Much of the early research into rescuers was not done by historians, but done by ethicists and sociologists and others who were trying to look at the kind of individual behavior or the communal behavior that went against the grain, and people who would engage in what was their term for it was altruistic behavior. What kind of person is it that at risk, and certainly no gain, and often at risk to himself, will simply for the sake of doing good, do good things for someone else? And altruism then became a topic, of course, that ethicists are very interested in. And they were looking for historical examples by which we could kind of study this as a historical and sociological phenomenon. And so much of the early work on rescue became part of what we might call altruism study. And very soon they realized there were several kinds of altruism. And in this case, one is kind of normative altruism. When everybody in the group is agreed on the norm of helping others. That is, here you don't have to engage in an act of nonconformity. The norm of the group itself is that you will be altruistic. And so altruism is the moral message, the moral norm to which most people in the community are adapting and conforming, and it is the oddball pariah outcast who is engaging in non-altruistic behavior, betraying the community, not cooperating with what the community accepts as its kind of common mission. And that is not so hard to explain. I mean, why a whole community? If you're in a community of normative altruism, it's easy to go along. More difficult is autonomous altruism, individuals that engage in altruistic activity that go against what everybody else around them is doing, who has the moral autonomy, that has the independence, that has the self-reliance, that they are able, basically by their own moral compass, divorced from all the pressures around them, to do what they think is right, to obey their own conscience, even when this puts them in conflict with everybody else around them, to perform an act of kindness, goodness to someone else, even at risk to themselves. So we have these two kinds of altruism. And in one, you have to explain how does a community become one with a norm of altruism. And the other, we have to look at how do individuals do that. So Le Chambon becomes, in a sense, the test case of why do we have communities of altruism? How do you create normative altruism where a whole community sees its task, sees its moral obligation to help others? And the key here, at least initially for most people studying the case, was that Le Chambon is, in a sense, already a minority village itself. France is predominantly Catholic. Le Chambon is a Protestant village. Protestants were the Huguenots, and that in history, the Huguenots had fought wars of religion in France in the 16th century to gain the right for the freedom of religious practice. They had won from the King of France a edict of religious toleration at the end of the 1500s. Louis XIV, the most overbearing French monarch, the famous Louis XIV of L'État c'est moi, I am the state, then revoked the edict of religious toleration in 1685, and from then until the French Revolution, until religious tolerance is once again decreed, Huguenots in France are persecuted. And many of them flee abroad. So you have Huguenot coming to the United States. If you go to the coast of North and South Carolina, you have Huguenot communities of early settlers to the United States. There was Huguenot communities that fled to Berlin in Germany, Prussia. Amsterdam had a very large Huguenot community. So many fled abroad to preserve their freedom of religion. The communities that survived were usually those in the most backward, rural, mountainous areas where they were the furthest reach from the central government. And Le Chambon is a town in the mountains of the Massif Central, that central mountainous plateau in southwestern France, furthest out of the reach of and of least interest to Louis XIV and the centralizing monarchs of France, where they held out and continued to exist as a persecuted religious minority in France for basically a century and a half. So when France finally gets religious tolerance, and after the French Revolution, they have a long tradition of opposition, a long tradition of survival as a commune intact, and they are not enchanted with and swept away by French nationalism. The French state has been their enemy, not the object of adoration. So when Pétain comes in with his conservative revolution, invoking the monarchy before the French Revolution, he is invoking the period when the Huguenots were persecuted. So in small wonder, in Le Chambon, the arrival of the Vichy regime is seen as the reemergence of a persecuting enemy state, not of a state that for the rest of France looks to for salvation, looks to for protection and relief. Theologically, the Huguenots also put great value on the Old Testament. Many Protestant groups had much more weight on the New Testament. They see themselves as a people not only of the New Testament, but of the Old Testament as well. And in that sense, are steeped in the Old Testament biblical teachings and thus have a kind of theological identification with the Jews. And so come 1940, if you were trying to pick an ideal commune that would be receptive to Jews persecuted by the French state, it would be the Huguenots of a town like Le Chambon that would see them as fellow persecutees on the basis of religion and fellow victims of a persecuting state like the French state. So that all lined up very nicely. On top of that, the pastor in Le Chambon, not only a Protestant in France, but also a pacifist, who was even more objecting to state because he saw it as what mobilizes people for war, and he is trying to teach his flock in the traditions of nonviolence, and thus is certainly against the kind of military symbolism of the regime of Marshal Pétain, hero of World War I. So in the opening months of Vichy, when Vichy is established, in Le Chambon, the mayor will not take an oath of allegiance to the Vichy regime. The church will not ring the church bells to celebrate the various holidays that Vichy regime celebrates. It is a town that is already in defiance, already in nonconformity, and already in a nonconformity based upon principle against the Vichy state. In 1940, of course, also, one of the things the Vichy state did receive was intern French Jews in the internment camps in the south. Pastor Trocmé, the head of the religious community in Le Chambon, decides he would like to go help the beleaguered internees, goes down, meets with the head of the Quakers, and says, how can I help? Can I volunteer? Can we bring volunteers to help in the camps? And the head of the Quakers said, we don't need more volunteers in the camps. We need villages that will take people if we can get them out of the camps. And Pastor Trocmé promises to go back to his town, and he meets with them and persuades them to make Le Chambon a village that will receive people who have been interned and to shelter them there. The advantage Le Chambon had here is that it was a town that had summer hotels, the high winter, higher altitude stuff, get away from the heat of the Rhone Valley. It had a summer, people want to vacation in the summer or get away from the heat, would come to the hotels in Le Chambon in the countryside, and they had a bunch of empty hotels. I will stop at that point, but we will pick up there on Tuesday.